Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first section of this course, which is on blockchain fundamentals. Now, in this video specifically, I'm going to talk to you about the differences between Web 1, Web 2, and Web 3, and then give you a very brief introduction to what a blockchain is. However, before we dive into that, let me describe what this section aims to teach you and what you can expect to learn throughout. So as the title states, we are teaching blockchain fundamentals. Now, really what that means is we're going to aim to answer three questions. What is a blockchain? How does a blockchain work, and why is it secure? Those are the three main things we're going to aim to teach you in this section. Now, to explain that, we're going to go through concepts like decentralization. We're going to talk about what a wallet is. We're going to talk about transactions, signatures. We're going to talk about blocks, what the first block in the blockchain is versus what later blocks are, and how those are created and mined. We're going to talk about algorithms like proof of work and proof of stake. We're then going to get into nodes and master nodes. And of course, we'll do an entire summary at the end of the section just so you understand everything kind of all in one as a whole. So we are really aiming to teach you the theoretical concepts here, all of the prerequisite knowledge that you should understand before trying to do any development on the blockchain. This is a very important section, so please pay attention to all of the videos and do all of the practice questions that we have just to make sure you're really understanding what's going on. So with that said, I hope you're excited to learn about blockchains. This is a very interesting topic, and it's really cool to understand some of the math, theory, and kind of concepts behind how all of this stuff is secure and how all of it works. So with that said, let's dive into this first video where I talk about Web 1, Web 2, and Web 3, and an introduction to blockchains. So I'm on the whiteboard now, and I'm going to start explaining to you what the difference is between Web 1, Web 2, and Web 3. Now, these are really the different stages of the internet, where Web 1 is kind of the most basic early stage of the internet, and Web 3 is kind of the future of the internet, and it's what we're moving towards today. So with that said, let's start looking at Web 1. Now, Web 1 had websites that looked like this. As I was saying, this is the earliest stage of the internet. This is when the internet was first invented, when people first had access to it, and this time period was roughly from 1991 to 2004. Now, as you can see on the right-hand side of my screen here, we had very basic websites. They didn't look very good. They weren't very interactive. It was really more about browsing and searching for information than it was actually interacting with a website, generating user content, and all of the stuff that we typically do today when we're interacting with the internet. So going through some of my points here, you can see we mostly had static pages. There wasn't a lot of dynamic content. It really was almost just like a book was placed on the internet. Continuing, this was referred to as the read-only web, again, because there wasn't much interaction. All we really did was just view a page, scroll through it, search for specific information. Actually, an interesting fact here in Web 1 was that running advertisements was banned. During Web 1, you could not advertise on the internet. Very interesting fact that a lot of people don't actually know about. Continuing, this was mostly used for information and research, and that's what I was saying. We're really just browsing the internet. We're not interacting. There's not a huge focus on styling or user experience. It's just information being distributed through web pages. Continuing here, we used frames and tables to position and align elements. As you can see here, everything is very boxy. It's very square. We don't have kind of those circular, rounded, soft edges like we'd see today, and that's pretty much it for Web 1. So moving on here to Web 2. Now, Web 2 is what I like to refer to as kind of the current state of the internet. Most of what you're interacting with in today's internet is Web 2 technology. Now, Web 2 had websites like this: Facebook, Twitter, Google, etc. This was really the era of communities, of user-generated content, and a lot of interaction with websites as opposed to just research and information. So going through the points here, so Web 2 refers to worldwide websites which highlight user-generated content, as I was discussing. This really focuses on interactions, social media, communities, graphical user interfaces. There was a lot more focus on user experience, on user interface design. That's what UI and UX stands for. Continuing, this brought the popularity of Ajax and JavaScript for dynamic websites. So you click a button, maybe an animation happens, the page changes, the state of the page has different content on it depending on what you're doing. Continuing here, this was really community focused. And then lastly here, user data was owned and controlled by intermediaries. Now, this is still the case. but companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc., they own all of your data. If you go on a platform like Twitter, for example, and you start posting stuff and tweeting stuff, those tweets are the property of Twitter. You do not own those tweets, even though they're associated with your account. Everything you've done there is owned by a central entity. In this case, it would be Twitter. Now, same thing on Facebook, same thing on Google. All of these websites, all of these companies, they own every piece of data that you put on their platform. So keep that in mind. That's a very important property here of Web 2.0. All of the data on the internet, with very few exceptions, is owned by central authorities, central entities, companies. And this really gives them a lot of control, as we've seen throughout kind of the past few years and what's gone on with data privacy and all of that type of stuff. So that's really the summary here of Web 2.0, and this is most of the stuff that you interact with today on the internet. Continuing here, we have Web 3.0. Now, when we talk about Web 3.0, this is really the future of the internet. Yes, we already see Web 3.0 technologies existing. There is parts of the internet now that are focused around Web 3.0, but this is really still a new thing, and it'll be probably a few years before we really adopt a lot of Web 3 technologies. So when we talk about Web3, we're talking, of course, about cryptocurrency, blockchain networks, so Bitcoin, Ethereum, stuff like the metaverse, all of that you could associate with Web3. And some of the properties here, there is a large focus on backend systems, databases, and ledgers. So what this really means is Web3 is focused on, okay, how is data stored? How is data controlled? Really focusing on the back end as opposed to the front end, which was a major focus of Web 2.0 with all of your nice user interfaces and animations and interactions and all of that in Web 2.0. Continuing here, data is not owned by a single party, but it is shared across a network. This is a massive property of Web 3.0. We want to decentralize everything, move away from having central companies or entities owning all of the data on the internet. Instead, this data is kind of owned by the network as a whole, so owned by everyone really, and shared across it. Continuing, Web 3.0 is meant to be portable and personal. It has immersion over interaction. So if you think of something like the metaverse, the goal here is not for you to just be interacting with the internet, but to be fully immersed in it to the point where you could live almost a life on the internet, right? Or in the internet, however you'd like to refer to that as. So we're really immersing people in everything that they have. Everything they do is kind of revolving around Web 3.0 technologies, around the internet, as opposed to with Web 2.0, you're just kind of interacting with a web page. Web 3.0, you want to be immersed into this. Continuing, we have blockchain and decentralization. So these are kind of technologies or tools that are a part of Web 3.0. We also have artificial intelligence. That's a large part of this as well, although, of course, you saw that in Web 2.0 as well. And that's really the main summary here of Web 3.0. So these are kind of new technologies, a new look at the internet. We're really focused on data here, back-end systems, and kind of protecting privacy, and also making sure that no central entity or authority owns all of the data. So now that we've talked about that, let's just have a quick look at a few examples here of Web 2.0 versus 3.0. So what I'm going to do here is just pop up a few images / topics and kind of discuss how they would differ from Web 2 versus Web 3. So the first one we have here is something like a tweet or posting content online. So if I were to make a tweet in Web 2, this tweet is completely owned and controlled by Twitter. They can decide if they want to censor it, they can remove my account, they can delete the tweet, they can ban me, they can give me a warning, etc., right? They have complete control because they own this data. They are Twitter, right? They own the entire network. Now, continuing here, if we were to talk about this in the context of Web 3, this would be a platform that would be decentralized. This would mean that there's no central authority, there's no main company that owns or controls all of the data. Instead, the data is owned and controlled by the network as a whole. So what that would mean is that no one could censor your tweets, no one could ban you, no one could delete a tweet. It would simply be, you make a tweet, it goes out there. Once it's there forever. It cannot be deleted, it cannot be modified, it cannot be changed. That is kind of how Web3 would handle something like user-generated content. Continuing here, we have something like PayPal. Now, when you sign up for PayPal, you have to put in a ton of different information. If you're in a specific country, you can only receive payments in specific currencies. There's all kinds of rules and regulations, and PayPal at any point in time could decide to shut you down. They could make it so you couldn't receive payments, you couldn't send payments, etc. Now, of course, if we were to contrast this with Web3, then this would be a platform that doesn't require any personal data. There's no, privacy concerns in Web3. This would just be a platform that you can use to send payments wherever you want, whenever you want, in any currency, in any format, etc. Now, there might be fees associated with that because of the way that Web3 works and different cryptocurrencies, but that would be the main difference, right? In Web2, this is a central company. They control everything. They have all of your data. In Web3, they don't need your data. They don't need to know who you are. You can send or you can send money, across freely. You can receive it. You can send it. You can do whatever. It doesn't matter where you're located or who you are. So continuing here, we have something like Rogers. Now, Rogers is a Canadian company. They're a telecom company. And the reason I put them here is just to illustrate what large of an effect a single entity can have on an entire country's economy. So if you're not familiar with Rogers, they are the largest telecom company in Canada. They'd be equivalent to something like T-Mobile or Verizon or TELUS if you're in the US. And recently there was a massive Rogers outage where there was no internet across the entire country of Canada for anyone who had Rogers for about an entire day. So a bunch of people that had their cell phones on Rogers, they were not able to access the internet. They had no data. Restaurants, companies, businesses, anyone who was on Rogers internet had no access to the internet. Now, the reason that happened was Rogers was trying to upgrade their servers, and when they did a server upgrade, they messed something up and essentially shut off the entire internet for all of their customers for an entire day. Now, again, the reason I put this here is to illustrate that in Web 2, that's something that can happen. The entire network can go down. If a server fails or if a company fails to maintain all of their operations, all of their servers, etc., then something like what I just described can happen. Now, in Web 3, this would not be the case. Servers really can't go down. The reason they wouldn't go down is because they would be controlled and distributed around the entire world and not controlled by a single entity or a single person. Now, we're going to talk more about how that works in the next section when we discuss decentralization, but the idea here is that if you had some internet or some network being provided in Web 3 that's not provided by one person or one factory or one farm of servers, this is provided by potentially hundreds of thousands of people all running their own nodes, all running their own computers that are supporting the network. And that would mean that it's almost impossible for that network to go down versus something like Rogers, where a few people make a mistake and all of a sudden half the country of Canada doesn't have access to the internet. So hopefully that gave you a good contrast here between the main differences between Web 2 and Web 3. Again, this is really focused on data, availability, security, privacy. We're going to talk more about that as we go through the rest of this section. So the last thing I want to do here is just give you a quick introduction to blockchains in general. So I just have a few paragraphs here and I'll read through them. So a blockchain is a system of recording information in a way that makes it difficult or impossible to change, hack, or cheat. Now, this is very important because the modern systems of today, even though we may trust them and we may believe that these three properties are true, impossible to change, hack, or cheat, it's really not the case. Even if you consider something like a bank that you would imagine would be very secure, it is possible to change the balance that's inside of your bank account. It is possible to hack or to cheat into that system. It's happened before. So the whole advantage of a blockchain is that we want to have some kind of system that is not reliant on some party, right? Some company, some entity, some person, etc. And we want this system to, again, be impossible to change, hack, or cheat compared to something like maybe our modern day banking system, where if the bank really wanted to, they could go in and make your balance zero. If a central government went to them and said, hey, we need all of the money out of this account, or we need to view what's inside of this account, etc., they would have to oblige to that, right? So that's one very important aspect of blockchain, is that it's a system that's impossible to change, hack, or cheat theoretically, and we will talk about kind of the math and security behind that later on. Continuing here, a blockchain is essentially a digital ledger of transactions that is duplicated and distributed across the entire network of computer systems on the blockchain. Now, that sounds complicated, it sounds like a mouthful, but really what this means is that a blockchain is tracking everything that happens. So if we consider a very basic blockchain where we're just sending money between different accounts, well, we are tracking every single transaction that occurs that happens on the ledger. The ledger is really just kind of a book or a log of different transactions. And this entire ledger is duplicated and distributed across thousands of different machines, the entire network. So rather than sitting on a single server or in a single kind of farm of servers, what it would do is it would sit across every single computer that is on this blockchain network, so that if a few computers were to go down or a few computers were to get hacked, the ledger itself would be secure. It would still be safely stored and copied across hopefully tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of different machines. Continuing, the last and probably one of the most important points here is that a blockchain is not owned by a central entity. So I keep saying this, and I know that it doesn't make complete sense because we haven't gotten into the architecture of a blockchain, but there's no single person, there's no company, there's no government that controls or owns a blockchain. It is the network, all of the people that are a part of this network that support the blockchain. Not one person owns it, not one person controls it, and again, this will make a lot more sense as we dive into these topics later in this section. So that is what I wanted to leave you with here today in this first video. Hopefully this was a decent introduction to some of the concepts and kind of ideologies maybe behind Web3, what we're aiming to do with Web3 technology, and how that differs from Web2. So the key takeaways really from this video is that Web3 is kind of the future of the internet. We're seeing the very beginning of it right now, but still a lot of what we use is Web 2 technologies, and Web 3 has this massive focus on sharing data as opposed to having data owned by a central entity and having everything be decentralized, removing the control from a government, from a company, from an individual person, and distributing that control across the entire network so that everyone kind of has equal rights, equal access, and I guess equal opportunity to use Web3 technology. Regardless, I hope this was a good introduction, and I look forward to seeing you in another Blockchain Expert video.